Warmly welcome to the very first Type 1 Thursday with me, Hanna, one of the founders of the low carb universe. And I am also, of course, a type 1 diabetic. So it might be quite fitting that I have these sessions maybe. And also I have worked as a coach for people with diabetes for a very long time. So I have snapped up one or two things that might be useful. So Type 1 Thursday is when I will take up one topic within the maybe low carb, but definitely diabetes world that I find it's important to discuss right now. And I am happy to today just cover the basics of why low carb is the very best, or no, actually not the very best for everyone, but why one should low carb with type 1 diabetes and why it's safe also. So yes, let's, I have a little list because it ended up being quite a lot that I wanted to say to you today, even though this is supposed to be the basic level, because maybe not everyone who's watching has diabetes or knows what diabetes is and why then low carb would make a difference or not. So I'm going to keep it very basic, and I promise you until the event that we are of course having in June in beautiful Stockholm, Sweden, called Diabetes, we will get into more depth, and I promise you that. But for now, let's keep it easy, let's keep it cash, let's keep it awesome so that everyone is on the same page at the same time. So yeah, I just wanted to actually start off with, for those of you who may be watching who don't quite know that there are different types of diabetes, I wanted to quickly go through the different types, or at least the main types. So type 1 is what I have. I was diagnosed when I was 2, and we will definitely get to my story at some point later, but not tonight, not this evening, and not in this live one. But I was diagnosed when I was 2, that much I can say, with type 1 diabetes, which means that my immune system has kicked out the insulin-producing cells of my pancreas. That's kind of a shame because insulin, as you may or may not know, is a very, very important hormone. It regulates a lot of things in the body, not least blood sugar, but also a lot of other things. So it's kind of a shitty deal when your body does not produce any insulin. That means that I've had to, since I was 2 years old, get insulin externally. So first it was syringes, then it was pens, and now I'm wearing an insulin pump, for example. But this will be for life, no matter how much low carb I eat, or keto, or no carbs at all, or if I eat okra or okra water or cinnamon or all of these weird things that are circulating around the internet that say that they're going to cure type 1 diabetes. Well, they don't, because they can't cure a malfunctioning organ. What we're hoping for is that someone can stop the immune attack, but not that we can restore the organ, unfortunately. So without any hope of a cure in this moment, that is type 1. We produce no insulin or not enough insulin, and that is our problem, and that's why we have to get insulin from the outside. On the other hand, type 2 is when the body's cell doesn't recognize the insulin that the body produces, so it becomes insensitive. And you may have heard of insulin resistance, and that's exactly what it is. That your body's cells doesn't recognize the insulin properly that you are producing, and so that is the problem with type 2. Type 2s produce insulin still, but the body doesn't recognize it to a high enough extent. That can be changed with different lifestyle measurements. Whereas type 1 is autoimmune, the cells have been demolished, and we don't produce insulin, or not enough, depending on which type it is. Then, of course, there are many other types of diabetes. There is LADA, there's MODY, there's 1.5, which is closest to LADA. There is gestational diabetes. There's so many versions of it that I won't go into today. But just as a basic intro to my Type 1 Thursday, let's just keep it at the simple level of keeping the amounts and types of diabetes to a minimum. So type 1 and type 2. Glad we're all on the same page. Now we can move on and talk more about why low carb is a very good answer to help manage type 1 diabetes, although it won't cure it. So basically, the official recommendations, what we're getting today still, in many, many cases, I know things are changing rapidly in the medical field, but still it is that type 1s should eat a lot of carbohydrates. And when I was diagnosed in 1985, we got the advice that, of course, it should be 60% of carbs with every meal, and, you know, drink skimmed milk, low-fat milk with every meal, and you get a bonus point, and then finish it off with some more carbs and have a fruit for dessert, and you get extra points. And how lovely is that? But I wish we would have known then what I know today, which is that that causes a whole myriad of things that you don't want, which is, for example, you know, all of these carbs, even for a non-diabetic person, it can cause things like obesity. It can cause, and especially in type 1s, there is a study that shows that there can be brain damage by hyperglycemia. So too high of a blood sugar can actually cause brain damage. There's cardiovascular disease, there's high blood pressure, there's even premature death and stuff like that. So it's not harmful to walk around with high blood sugars the whole time, which is what you essentially, as a result, get from the official dietary recommendations at this point. There are many people working out there to change this, hopefully us included, but and we're working on it, but it goes slowly because this has been the regime for so long that it takes time to change it. On the other hand, there's only 30% of type 1 diabetics who are adults who actually reach the ADA HbA1c goal. So the HbA1c is basically, easily explained, it is the average blood sugar level for your past 3 months. In a very simple explanation, that is it, and that has to be underneath a certain value for the ADA to accept it as being in goal. And that number is already super, super high in comparison to a healthy person. So I think it's up by 6-7%. 6.5% is, of course, the limit for prediabetes, which is already super high. That is about twice as high as blood sugar should be. On the other hand, and this is where it gets really interesting, last year there was a study published where I was part of it in the journal Pediatrics, a medical study about type 1 grit, this wonderful group that is based on Dr. Bernstein's wonderful principles of higher protein meals instead of relying on carbs. And in that study, it showed that 97% of the people in that study reached the goals of the ADA. So who, in my opinion, it's a little bit, you know, who should you trust? The ones who actually get results and go on to thrive, and they thrive in schools, and they thrive in life, and they are athletes, and they are, you know, all these kids that are fantastic. The grown-ups don't share that much, but we're awesome too. No, but a very much healthier life than, you know, with a A1C level that is so high that it becomes toxic to the body. So you know, in my opinion, the answer is very easy, but it's up to each and every one to decide which one suits them the most. So I thought of 5 great reasons why low carb is great for type 1 diabetics. Hi, Justin! And number 1 is, of course, that in comparison to carbohydrates, proteins and fats are only slightly insulinogenic. So they only need very slight amount of insulin in comparison to be covered and to be obtained by the body. So that is why, for me, it's a no-brainer to rely my diet more on proteins and fats rather than carbohydrates that are going to cause these blood sugar spikes that I'm not going to feel well by, and also then end up that because my blood sugar is going up and down the whole time, that means that my average blood sugar level is going to be higher, my A1C is going to be higher, which means that I will then be at risk for the things that for all the complications, but also obesity, cardiovascular disease, higher blood pressure, premature death, not to mention, of course, the devastating complications of diabetes, which is, of course, everything from nerve damage to blindness to kidney failure to all of these things that are so heartbreaking. So why risk it? So that is one of my first thing, that proteins and fats are definitely less insulinogenic than carbohydrates. So you need less insulin, and that's why it becomes easier to manage. And I'll get to that in a couple of points. Secondly, it is, of course, because you're reducing the problem that diabetics have is that there's too much sugar in the blood. There's too much sugar for the body to take care of. There's too much to handle for it because we're lacking that component to get it into our cells manually or automatically. We have to add it manually, the insulin. So why then aggravate the problem with more sugar? So basically, this is the best way of lowering the amount of sugar that you have in your blood that is already too high. If you don't add sugar with the meals, you're already at a better level than you would have been otherwise. So that is fantastic. And that, of course, also lowers your A1C, that lowers your average blood sugar, that lowers your blood pressure, all of these beautiful things that we know and we have seen in so-called healthy people, we can also see in type 1 diabetics, of course. It's the same thing. It's less obesity, it's less all of these things. And then, of course, the goal is for type 1s as well as type 2s and whoever has blood sugar issues is to have a normal, a stable blood sugar level, and that is all that we can ask for. And that is how we can even slightly ensure that we will have a long and healthy and happier life than with the blood sugar roller coaster that goes like this. Number 3 is, of course, a concept that is my favorite concept in all of the type 1 world, which is, of course, the geekiest thing I think I've ever said in my life. But anyway, it is fantastic because it is the law of small numbers. And this was thought out by, of course, Dr. Richard Bernstein, who is a type 1 himself since many years. And he's also an endocrinologist and all this stuff. And he thought of the rule of small numbers, which means if you add small amounts of carbohydrate, you only have to cover it with small amounts of insulin. Means that there's small variations in blood sugar values and less margin of error, which of course means if you add large amounts of carbs, you need to cover it with even larger amounts of insulin, and then your error margin and the predictability goes out the roof, maybe somewhere it goes out, and it becomes no longer predictable. You can't do anything about it. And actually, Bitte, this is a trick that I learned from you, but this is the best way I can show you about this. So this is an arrow. And basically, if you eat a little bit of carbs, your blood, and this arrow actually marks your blood sugar level. And so if you eat a little bit of carbs, you know, it just goes like slightly up, and then you have a little bit of insulin and then you bring it back down, and then you eat a little bit of carbs, and then, you know, stuff like that. And that goes, of course, also for the protein part of your meal. It's not only the carbs. On the other hand, let's bring back my arrow, or Bitte's arrow, actually. Anyway, if you eat a lot of carbs, look what happens to your blood sugar. Zoop. It goes up. And then you have to cover it with a lot of insulin, meaning that it plummets again. And then you're on this roller coaster the whole day long. And especially if you follow the guidelines that tell you to eat, you know, up to 6 times a day and all carbs, basically, then you have this literally all day long. And how are you going to be productive or feel well or healthy or happy if your blood sugar keeps on doing that the whole day? In my opinion, and in my experience, which is now 34 years of this stuff, this feels a lot better than this. Graphic enough for you? So that is definitely one thing. And with this, of course, when you're not playing with that much insulin and not that much carbs, there's a lot less, of course, of things like diabetic ketoacidosis, because you're never going to have that. Maybe even if you miss, God forbid, but even if you miss taking a dose by a couple of hours, you're never going to have this huge insulin sort of that there is a relative lack of insulin in your body. You're always going to have enough for at least the basis. And then another thing is, for example, hospitalizations for low blood sugars, hypoglycemia. They're going to be a lot less as well, because you don't have these huge doses that press down your blood sugar through the ground, through the basement, and you end up passing out somewhere, which I may or may not have done earlier in my diabetic career. Not on low carb though, never on low carb, but always on high carb, which is also interesting. Then number 4, and this is something I feel I need to clarify this early on, even though this is a long series of many weeks of type 1 Thursdays, but ketosis, nutritional ketosis, is not the same as diabetic ketoacidosis. Diabetic ketoacidosis requires a lack of insulin in your body. If you don't give your body or don't produce enough, which, both can happen to me. I don't produce enough, but if I get something wrong with my insulin pump, or if I miss something, or something, I don't know, anything can happen, malfunction. If I risk that, if I risk an lack of insulin in my body, then yes, my ketones will go out of hand and I will end up in diabetic ketoacidosis. But this is not due to the diet that I eat. It's not because of the low carb. It's not because I already have ketones in my system, because that happens on a low carb diet sometimes. It is only because my body is lacking insulin, nothing else. And that can happen to anyone. And imagine then if you eat these huge heaps of carbs that you are advised to do by certain healthcare professionals, and then, for example, miss to dose insulin for it, or you haven't taken enough insulin for it, then you have a relative risk of insulin, of lack of insulin in your body. And that's just the way it goes. So in my opinion, and this I've seen actually being argued elsewhere as well, the normal diabetic diet is actually more dangerous in terms of diabetic ketoacidosis than a low carb diet, which I thought was very interesting, and I find it very true. There's 3 things that you have to do in order to prevent a ketoacidosis from happening. A diabetic ketoacidosis is 1, give your body the insulin it needs. So whether that is only basal insulin or basal and bolus or whatever regimen works for you, give it the insulin that it needs and that you can see on your blood sugars. Which leads me to number 2, is always check your blood sugars. Keep an eagle eye on your blood sugars. Have a CGM if you can afford one, or if you can access one. Have one, because they're really, really great to see the trends. Absolute values, but we'll talk about that in another episode, but it's all good. And then number 3, keep hydrated, because that is very, very important. So that's how you avoid a diabetic ketoacidosis. And as I said, nutritional ketosis is a natural state, but it's not the goal of a low carb diet for type 1. It's a side thing, really. Number 5, and I'll make this short because this is very, well, it's my own opinion, really. So it's easy to eat low carb. It's so much easier than having to calculate stupid carb ratios and all of this stuff. It's so much easier to not have to do that and just care. You know that you can eat this and this and these things, and that's fine. You don't have to experiment with high insulin dosages. You don't have to experiment with different basal values depending on what you've eaten. You can just eat and feel well and have normal blood sugars and just figure everything out a lot easier, because you're removing that component of adding a lot of sugar into your bloodstream, as well as a lot of insulin and everything that I've yapped on about for the past 20 minutes. That means that you have no roller coaster, no blood sugar roller coaster, at least very often not. And it also means, for me personally, eating low carb means that I feel a lot freer than, that might seem very contradictory, because it is, of course, a very so-called restrictive diet, and you can only eat these and these, and you're eliminating a whole food group and all of this stuff. But that's not it at all. That, for me, that is more imprisonment, having to calculate all of these things, and everything goes wrong anyway, and you have these huge spikes and up and down, as I showed you with the arrow, instead of just eating delicious food that you know you can handle and require a lot less insulin, meaning a lot less margin of error, and you will become, your blood sugar will become more predictable. That was episode 1 of Type 1 Thursday here on the Low Carb Universe pages on social medias. And I am happy to answer any questions you may have. So leave them in a comment, and I will see you next week for episode 2 of Type 1 Thursdays on the low carb universe, because we of course have the diabetes event in Sweden in June, which I think you should join us at. I'll see you next week.